Hi, and thanks for watching. I feel like I should start the series by covering some of the basics because I don't know if things are gonna make sense or matter if I don't. So for the very first episode, I'm gonna do a biography of my uncle, Carl Laemmle, who founded Universal Studios, because there wouldn't be a studio or my family or this series if it wasn't for him. So I think that's a good place to start. So I'll talk a little bit about his childhood, his move to the US, his start in the film industry, and a bit about his later life as well. So this is Carl Laemmle. And to give a little perspective to that, here's a picture of me with a life-size cardboard cutout of Carl. He was very short, he was only 5'2", but what he lacked in height, he more than made up for in presence and personality. Carl was born January 17, 1867 in a small town in Germany called Laemmle. His father, Julius, sold small parcels of land around Germany, and his mother, Rebecca, was a housewife. Carl was the 10th of 13 children, but unfortunately 8 of his brothers and sisters died very early on of scarlet fever. Carl's parents were pretty poor, so when he was 13, a man in the Jewish world, his mother set him up with an apprenticeship about 40 miles from home in a town called Eichenhausen with a company called S.G. Heller. And at first when Carl found out he'd be living there, he was furious. He kicked and he screamed and he cried and he swore he wouldn't go. But I think he came to realize it was a good opportunity, and he went and he worked really hard, and within a couple years he worked his way up from being just an errand boy to bookkeeper, the office manager, and soon he was traveling for the company. Carl's older brother Joseph was already living in the United States and he loved it. He'd write home letters all the time about how great it was, best country in the world. Carl had to come join him, and it really got Carl excited about going. Unfortunately, Carl's mother got wind of the plan and made him promise that so long as she was alive, he wouldn't leave the country. Wouldn't you know it, a couple months later, she got sick, she died, and within 3 months, 17-year-old Carl was on a ship to America. Carl went through Castle Garden, sort of the pre-Ellis Island, to New York City. He didn't speak very much English, but he did get a job working at a drugstore, but he hated it. He only made like $4 a week, but he couldn't find anything else. He knew that Joseph was living somewhere in the United States, and he was pretty sure he was in Chicago, but he didn't really know how to get in touch with him. A friend of Carl's recommended that he write to a newspaper in Chicago to see if anyone knew who or where Joseph was, and miraculously, Joseph was working at the paper, got the letter, and sent a train ticket for Carl the very next day. Once in Chicago, Carl worked various odd jobs for years. He was a merchant, a bookkeeper, a farmer. He worked in Illinois, the Dakotas, Wisconsin, but everything he did, he always worked really hard and he always got promoted. In 1898, he was working at a clothing shop in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and he met and married his boss's daughter, Rachel. And they had 2 kids, Rosabelle and Julius, who became known as Carl Jr. And even though Carl was doing really well, he was supporting his family fine, I think it was having the kids that made him say, I want to step it up and I want to do more. And on a train ride back to Chicago, he saw his very first Nickelodeon. It was still sort of an unknown upstart at the time, and he saw the crowd waiting outside and he kind of did the math, and that's when he realized, this is it. This is my next venture. So in 1906, at the age of 39, Carl rented an empty warehouse in Chicago and opened up his very first theater, which he called the White Front. And within 2 months, he made enough to open up a second theater, which he called the Family Theater. And a couple months after that, he started the Laemmle Film Service, which distributed films to theaters. And by 1909, that was the biggest film company in the entire country. So I'll definitely get into this more in another video because it is more than another video's worth of information in itself. But one of my uncle's greatest, but probably least known accomplishments is his win against Thomas Edison and the trust. Basically, Thomas Edison owned the patents to a bunch of parts that were in the cameras used in the day. And because of this, he created this thing called the trust, where if you were going to make a movie, you had to go through him to do it. And they threatened litigation against anyone who didn't. And you had to pay a lot of money, and it was really keeping the industry down at the time. So finally, my uncle said, enough is enough. I'm not putting up with it anymore. And he got together a couple of the other big filmmakers of the day, like William Fox and Adolph Zukor, to fight with him against the trust. He opened up his own production company to counter the trust, which he facetiously named the Independent Moving Pictures Company, or IMP. And the whole thing was fought out in the courts. And ultimately, the courts decided that Edison and the trust and the monopoly that they had far exceeded what was legal, and they shut the whole thing down. And this fight led by my uncle is what really led to the movie boom and movie stars and studios and everything that we know in the industry today. It's just wow, you know? In 1912, Carl took on his biggest venture yet. He combined IMP with a couple other production companies and created the Universal Picture Company in, believe it or not, Fort Lee, New Jersey. They did have some offices in New York before that, but Fort Lee is really where the first studio was. In 1915, he moved that out to what is now Universal City, California, but I really want this episode to be about Carl and not Universal, so just know that Universal's still going strong. It's 101 years old. It's a massive success and amazing. Carl was always ahead of his time and not afraid to take a stand or make a statement, and his films with Universal often reflected that. They would push boundaries and talk about things that weren't yet cool or popular to talk about. So his first film with Universal, for instance, Traffic in Souls, talked about forced prostitution in the United States. Or 1934's Imitation of Life tackled racism before it was really a mainstream issue. And he was doing amazing things outside of the studio too. During World War II, he personally saved hundreds of Jews from the Holocaust by paying for their visas and setting them up with homes and jobs here in the United States. He spent more than $1 million of his own dollars doing this, and when the Secretary of State wouldn't allow him to sponsor any more people, he wrote to every friend and relative that he knew to talk them into bringing more people over. Carl eventually retired and moved to a home in Benedict Canyon. He died in 1939 at the age of 72, but clearly his work and his legacy still live on. He always worked really hard in everything that he did. He was loved by everyone. He always kept his friends and family close, and everyone called him Uncle Carl, relative or not. And Universal's still going strong, like I said, in its 101st year, and it's got such a rich history, so much to it. Not everyone now knows the name Carl Laemmle, though I think they should, but everyone knows his work and some really amazing stuff. Alright, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them below. You can follow me on Twitter or Instagram at Antonia Carlotta, and I'll post again next week.